You lose someone. You call it a funeral. You wear black, you say a few words, you bury them or you burn them, and then you go home. It feels formal, it feels modern. It feels like something your species invented recently, somewhere between religion and etiquette. But the real answer is far stranger. Long before you had a word for grief, your ancestors were already doing something with their dead that looked nothing like an accident. They were arranging bodies, placing objects beside them, choosing spots that meant something. And the deeper scientists dig, the older this behavior gets, and the less it looks like culture, and the more it looks like something written into you. Start with a question. What is a body once the person is gone? For most of your evolutionary history, the answer was simple. A body was food, or it was a hazard, or it was nothing at all. Predators didn't bury their dead. Herds walked past a fallen member without pause. Death was information, at best, never ceremony. Then something changed. At a cave system called Cima de los Huesos in northern Spain, researchers pulled thousands of hominin bones from a shaft nearly 50 feet underground. No natural way in, no river current, no animal den, no reason for so many bodies to end up there by accident. The paleoanthropologist Maria Martinon Torres, who has spent years studying this site, has pointed to something unsettling in the pattern. The bodies weren't scattered the way a flood or a predator would leave them. They accumulated the way something intentional accumulates. This was over 300,000 years ago, before Homo sapiens existed, before language, as far as anyone can prove, and already someone was carrying the dead somewhere on purpose. Why would a species do that? Here's the plain English version of the leading idea. Grief did not begin as a feeling. It began as a problem. A dead body decays. It draws scavengers. It carries disease. Living near a corpse or ignoring one has consequences you can smell and consequences you can catch. So the earliest response to death may not have been sadness at all. It may have been risk management, the same instinct that makes you wash your hands, dressed up in behavior that looks, from the outside, like reverence. But that explanation only carries you so far. Because somewhere along the way, humans stopped just moving bodies away from danger. They started arranging them. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologist Ralph Selecki uncovered Neanderthal remains in the 1950s and 60s that seemed to be surrounded by clusters of pollen. He proposed that flowers had been placed with the dead. This became known almost instantly as the flower burial, and it made headlines around the world. A Neanderthal, that supposedly brutish cousin of yours, mourning with flowers. Later research complicated the story. Some scientists suggested burrowing bees, not mourners, may have carried the pollen in. Science does that. It revises itself. But even with the flowers in question, something about Shanidar still hasn't been explained away. The body, known as Shanidar III, was a Neanderthal man who lived with a badly injured arm for years before he died. Someone let him live long enough to become an elder, despite being unable to fully provide for himself. And when he died, he was placed in a specific spot in the cave, again and again, alongside others, over generations. That's not an accident. That's a pattern. Move forward again, to a cave in Israel called Kafze. Around 100,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens buried a child there with a pair of deer antlers placed carefully across the chest. The archaeologist Arella Hovers, who has studied burials like this across the region, has described how deliberate the positioning of early human graves tends to be. Not tossed in a pit, placed, curled, sometimes with tools, sometimes with ochre, a red mineral pigment that shows up again and again at ancient burial sites, for reasons no one can fully prove, but everyone finds hard to ignore. Why ochre? Why red? One idea, discussed by researchers including Ian Tattersall, is that red pigment may have symbolized blood, and blood may have symbolized life itself. Painting a corpse red might have been an attempt to return something the body had lost. That's speculation dressed as science, and honest researchers will tell you so. But the alternative explanation isn't much less strange. Either your ancestors were performing an early form of symbolic thought about death, or they were doing something so consistent, across so many unrelated groups that it might as well have been symbolic. Here's where the story bends. The archaeologist Paul Pettit, who has spent much of his career studying what he calls the archaeology of death, argues that mortuary behavior didn't arrive all at once as a single invention. It built up in layers. First, simple disposal to manage smell and disease. Then, spatial memory, returning to the same cave, the same shaft, the same patch of ground. Then, at some point, something extra. Objects that served no practical purpose for the corpse. Positioning that took effort with no survival benefit. A child, an antler, deliberately placed together by people who gained nothing from the labor except whatever feeling made the labor feel necessary. That feeling is the twist. Because if early humans were already treating death as something more than disposal hundreds of thousands of years before writing, before agriculture, before anything you'd call civilization, then grief isn't a cultural invention layered on top of biology. Grief might be closer to the operating system. Think about what that means. Every funeral you've ever attended, every headstone, every flower laid at a grave, every photograph kept beside a bed, might be a direct descendant of a neanderthal returning to the same cave to lay a body in the same spot, generation after generation, for reasons nobody wrote down because nobody needed to write them down. It was simply what you did. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, in a good way, because your instinct might be to think of ancient death rituals as primitive, a rough first draft that modern humans eventually refined into something meaningful. But the evidence suggests almost the opposite order. The meaning came first. The Polish came later. Shanidar III didn't get flowers, real or imagined, because Neanderthals had figured out religion. He got them, or something like them, because a group of individuals who lived and hunted and struggled beside him were unwilling to simply leave him where he fell. That's not primitive. That's the whole point. So think about the last time you stood at a funeral, or scrolled past a memorial post online, or kept a voicemail from someone who is gone because you couldn't bring yourself to delete it. It probably felt like a personal choice, a modern, individual, complicated feeling. It isn't only that. It's also an echo, a 300,000-year-old echo, running through a shaft in Spain, a cave in Iraq, a grave in Israel, all the way into your chest, telling you, the same way it told them, that a body is never just a body. And a goodbye is never really the end of the story.